Welcome to Change the Climate, the program about the Olympia chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby and efforts to create the political will for a livable world. Now here's your host, Ari Simmons.
Hi, our guest today is Lynn Reveal, and Lynn is a public health professional here to talk to us about a whole food, plant-based diet. Hi Lynn.
Hi Ari.
How's your holiday season going?
It's going great, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. It's a pleasure to have you here today. This is our first time officially meeting, so maybe give our audience a little bit of a background about you, and then tell us why a plant-based whole food diet is important.
Okay. Well, I started this journey in microbiology and had a background in the sciences, and then went on into public health. Most of my professional career was in lung health, and with a focus on reducing tobacco use in society. So I was in California in the days when the first smoke-free spaces, both indoor and like outdoor patio areas, were created, which people your age probably don't even remember. It's been so long ago.
Vaguely.
They think it's always been this way, but it took a lot of effort and work. And then I lived in Europe for about 20 years and came back to the Washington area in 2015. And upon arriving back in the States, I had an opportunity to be trained as a facilitator in a program called the Complete Health Improvement Program. And it's helping people make the transition from the Western diet to whole food plant-based diet. So the question people ask is, why would you do that, and why would you be interested in that? Well, I learned that a lot of the chronic diseases that plague our Western societies have to do with the diet that we're eating. And after World War II, we really changed from a lot of homegrown, locally produced food to this industrialized model where we raise, I think, 99% of the animals that are consumed in an industrial setting. That brings with it all kinds of problems, environmental problems. The food is less healthy, so we have health problems, and not just environmental problems related to climate change, but all the waste that's produced and all the water that's consumed, especially in animal agriculture. So it just all coalesced, and I am part of two groups of people who are trying to make this transition. One is more focused on the health reasons, and one is more focused on the environment. And I'm so glad that what's good for the human body is also good for the planet. So that when you make changes, you're helping not only yourself, but you're helping address the biggest problem that we have today, and this is climate change on a global scale.
So you mentioned plant-based and whole food, and these are pretty heavy terms in terms of, making changes and things like that. Can you explain sort of what these two terms are, and then what sort of changes you need to transition to this?
I can do that. Whole food, we actually have a new pyramid to guide our food choices. And you can see the bottom of that pyramid are fruits and vegetables. So that's the largest amount of your plate, are fresh fruits and vegetables. The next up is grains, whole grains. And then we have green leafy vegetables and the beans and pulses. And at the very top of this pyramid, we have high-calorie foods, seeds, nuts, avocados, that you would use less of in a total diet. Now, when we avoid animal products, I'm talking about meat and dairy, things like eggs, we can improve our health, because thousands of studies now show that there's a strong correlation between chronic disease and the consumption of animal products. And beef is probably the worst of anything if you're thinking about your health. And when we talk about chronic diseases, I'll just name a few because maybe that term is too general. I'm talking about heart disease, cancer, diabetes 2. I'm talking about autoimmune disease, autoimmune diseases. I'm talking about osteoporosis. Things that many people in our society are having to deal with, bowel diseases, are diet related. So these are the diseases that you can prevent, especially if you're someone your age. Arrest, if you've already developed a disease, you can stop its progression. And in some cases, you can reverse a chronic disease. And there have been great steps forward reversing, for instance, heart disease and type 2 diabetes. People can get off medications and actually heal their bodies. Food has a tremendous power to heal if you just give your body what it needs. So the whole has to do with eating non-processed food. So we avoid refined foods. And if you're really strict and trying to, for instance, reverse a disease, we're talking about added oils. Oil, if you extract oil from the olive or oil from the grain or the coconut, you have a refined food that's high calories, no fiber, and doesn't really add much nutrition to your diet. So the whole is for unrefined, and plant-based means avoiding animal products.
So when I think about eating these things, automatically my mind goes to cost, right? There's in order to transition, there's a lot of people in our country, in our county, in our cities that aren't able to afford this transition or don't really understand what this transition means or looks like for themselves or for their families. So can you kind of explain how to begin to think about transitioning to this diet, especially when we live in a world where junk food or processed food is inexpensive and it's addicting?
I think you're right. But as far as cost, yes, high volume processed fast food is cheap. But I found that I save money eating this way because beans are so much cheaper than meat or cheese. And whole grains you can buy in bulk. It takes a little bit more planning and organization, but I'm actually saving money eating this way. And cost, I think once people get into this lifestyle, they realize the benefits to their pocketbooks. And I think that's exciting because that's just money out of your pocket, and it doesn't even bring into the equation the environmental cost of eating fast food or eating animal products. So when I think about this topic, I'm thinking about actually three things. One is the food choice that we make every day, and we all have to make food choices, and there are good reasons to eat whole food plant-based for our health, but also for the planet. There's a book that came out in 2018 that talks about the consequences to the earth if we choose animal-based products. And I'll just share some of the statistics with you. There are about 3 animals alive on Earth for every human being. And the reason for this is our industrial animal production for food. This industrial agriculture occupies more than half of our arable land. 1 acre of ground can raise 250 pounds of beef, but on that same acre, if you used it to grow human food, you could grow 50,000 tomatoes or 40,000 potatoes. So it's a very costly way to use the land that we have available. Beef raising is responsible for about 80% of deforestation in the Amazon. It's responsible for 60% of our biodiversity loss, which is another huge issue for the planet. And depending on the source that you look at, animal consumption, production and consumption, is responsible for between 14 and 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So by choosing a plant-based lifestyle, you can reduce your carbon footprint by more than your transportation choices. And I think that's huge. People don't realize that. So you're reducing your carbon footprint, and you're also saving money if you learn how to cook and eat this way. So it's really exciting making these choices, both for your own benefit and for the planet. And then if we go on, so how do you acquire food if you've decided to eat this way? Well, eating whole food plant-based requires a little bit more planning. You decide what your meals are going to be, and you shop to buy the ingredients for those meals. And when you do this planning, two things happen. You're less open to impulse buying, and we waste a lot of money impulse buying because, oh, this looks good, I'll probably use that, but probably we won't. It'll sit in our refrigerator until we have to throw it out. So by planning, you can make better use of the food that you do purchase. And you can also make choices to buy local. If you buy local, then you reduce your carbon footprint by reducing the amount of transport required to get food to your table. And you can also buy food with less packaging. The refined food that we buy, the cookies and the chips and the things, they come with a lot of packaging that ends up in the landfill. So that's another climate issue that you can help to resolve. Also, better use of the freezer. If you've bought something and you realize I'm not going to get around to eating it, all this fresh produce can be frozen, and you can freeze fruit, you can freeze vegetables, and you can put frozen fruit in smoothies. They won't taste the same as a fresh apple, a frozen apple. And frozen vegetables you can put in soups and stews. So it's all good. You can make sure that you're not wasting as much food. I read a statistic that 45% of food waste comes from our own personal use of food and restaurant use, where food is thrown out from restaurants. So that brings us to this third issue of waste. How do we reduce waste? And that has a lot to do with how we acquire food. But also, inevitably, when we do our own cooking, we're going to have food waste. So what can you do with that banana peel or that orange peel? You can save it, and I have a little container in my sink where I save organic material that I'm not going to eat. And I use it for compost in my own garden, or I have access to a public compost bin that I put it in. And if we compost our food waste, and it doesn't end up in a landfill where it produces methane, and methane is a real strong greenhouse gas, and if we can avoid that, why not? And compost brings us back to the issue of gardens and keeping our soils healthy. There's a lot of good information out there now on rebuilding soils. The industrialization of agriculture has led to poor soil quality, and that's one of the issues that the United Nations is focusing on now, that we're killing our soils and we won't be able to grow the food that we need. So we can be part of the solution by composting at the end of our food choices and help the planet that way too.
Wow, well that was a wealth of information, and I think you present some really compelling reasons to make the transition.
I have some resources. I'll send some photos to the film editor. And one is, if you want to make this change yourself, there's a book called How Not to Die, which is a pretty provocative title.
Right.
But what it's telling us is how to make food choices so that you reduce your risk for developing chronic disease, because that affects your quality of life. It's Dr. Michael Greger, and maybe he can slip a picture of the cover in. That's a good start. Another program is Forks Over Knives, and I can send some visuals for that also. It's more of a lay program. A bunch of firemen realized they wanted to start eating this way, and it's a story of their transition. And now they have lots of free recipes and encouragement out there on their website. So lots of resources to turn to now that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, and those resources I think are really important because so many people I know who have tried to make this transition either relapse back into eating processed foods, with how readily available they are and how addicting that they're making foods. I know that making the transition is not always the easiest task, but with resources and with support and encouragement, I seriously think that we can turn our perspective around on this. And
we actually have two groups. One meets at noontime every other month, and another meets in the evening every month. And it's people who are interested in making this transition, and we're helping each other learn new cooking methods, substitutions in our favorite recipes to bring them in compliance. And those groups are advertised on the TCAT website. So I would encourage people to go there and look at the calendar, and they'd be welcome to join one or other of those groups.
Wonderful. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today. I think our audience learned some really great tips and tricks and information about a whole food, plant-based diet. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you for having me.
My guest today is Ed Erickson, producer of Change the Climate. And this is a very special occasion because it's our last show.
Yeah, last show, yeah.
Last show.
Yeah.
But it's not the end.
No, it's never the end. I mean,
We've had solar experts, environmental activists,
Yeah.
educators,
No, we
public
have.
health
Yes.
officials. We've had
Yes.
the whole gamut.
we've had the whole
Everyone knows
gamut,
what they need to know now.
and climate change is going to take decades to actually, to fix. So, as long as, the people are out there, and there are so many good people that we've talked to, and Thurston County is really lucky in the people that they have, and the attitude of Olympia, I think.
Absolutely.
We have had, I'm going to go over it, ready?
Yes.
All right, so the last guest we had was, we had Barb Scavizzi. That was last month.
Oh, amazing woman.
Right.
When we moved to Washington State in 2007, we went up to Rainier, which, just fabulous. And I saw the Nisqually Glacier. And I wondered, why is all that bare rock and dirt showing, I wasn't covered up with any vegetation. And then I later found out that the glacier was receding. And this is a problem not only for the environment, but for people, because we depend on the glaciers and snowpack for our water. So then I started to realize this is a serious problem. What can we do about it? And the problem is that we are producing too much carbon dioxide. We're wasting the carbon that we have by burning our fossil fuels, cutting down our trees, in our agricultural systems, digging up the soil and exposing all the carbon instead of storing it in the soil. And, now I've got grandkids, and what can I do about this? I can't just sit back and not do anything. So I became a climate reality leader. I was trained by Al Gore, and one of the things that he would say is change minds, not light bulbs. And he encouraged people to vote and get out into the community and take action.
And how do you see all of those things sort of intersecting with some of the core systemic things like climate change and racial inequity? How do you see the social justice components combining with environmentalism to really form the kind of community that we would like to see in the future?
I mean, I think for me, we talk about, climate change, and you'll talk to people and about, we need to do these things, and people would turn around and be like, oh, it's so complex. And I think, when we look at, racial equity and economic justice and environmental justice and how we look at those things, we often think, oh, those are so complex as well. I increasingly believe that while the problems we've created are complex. The ways by which we can clean them up are not. Engagement and really listening to each other is something that works no matter what you're looking at, whether that's climate change or organizational development or working with inner city kids or helping an architecture firm figure out how to move into a new office space without killing each other, right? These are, what it all comes down to is how we respect each other, how we respect the spaces in which we work together, how we respect the planet that we live on, and the other entities that we share this planet with. And when you come from that core of dedicated inclusion, outcomes are different. I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that.
I mean, the idea is to address climate change, and what the bill would do would be to impose a fee on the use of fossil fuels, and this would be at their point that they come into the economies. And so this would be coal, it would be natural gas, oil, and such. And this fee would start out at a fairly low level, technically $15 per metric ton. You have to say what that means. And then would increase by $10 a metric ton each year. But it would be a predictable increase. The point of it is that you and me, ordinary people, and companies that use fuel in whatever they do, and most companies, manufacturing companies, are going to be using fuel in one way or another, that for them, the price of oil and gas would effectively be higher because of this fee, because the companies would have to pass that on to us, which we understand.
Right.
And this would be an incentive for companies to start moving to renewable energy, solar, wind, other methods that would not involve burning fossil fuel. And this would mean that we would get a shift, a natural shift. It would be a market-based sort of process. And individuals might very well decide to get an electric car or to move in some ways away from using as much fossil fuel.
Now I believe, I don't have the exact statistics, but I think there's between 15 and 20,000 solar installs in Washington State. And it's actually very challenging to do solar in Washington State because we don't have a great solar resource. I mean, compared to the rest of the nation, our light levels are pretty low, especially in the wintertime because of a marine climate. And our electricity rates are some of the lowest in the country. So compared to other areas that have higher electricity rates and a better solar resource, it's better in Kansas or New Jersey even, or the Southwest especially, but it still works here, and that's the important thing, and it works quite well. And I like to offer my own property as an example of that. I've got 4 solar systems on 4 buildings, and with all the employees, we net zero. We produce as much electricity in a year as we use in a year. And I think my production meter shows well over 50,000 kilowatt hours that we've produced from the solar array. Solar works from dawn till dusk. It works 365 days a year. It works in cloudy weather. That's one of the misnomers. People think you have to have sun, and no, it works off light. As long as the solar panels are evenly bathed with light, they'll produce.
So early on, I remember walking through our farmer's market downtown, and there was this guy walking around with a clipboard. He was trying to get support for Initiative 732, which would have placed a price on carbon, very similar to what CCL is promoting, actually, but on a smaller scale. That was David Fauch, who's the son of a former mayor of Olympia, and he also expressed interest at that time in starting a chapter of this organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. And he described to me what he thought that was. He was just learning about it too, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'd like to talk with you about that. And from that point on, and that was before summer in 2016, he formed a chapter. We held some first initial meetings. We found a few people in Olympia that were interested. And then from that point on, we've met every month for the last several years now, where we talk about climate change, what policy changes might be implemented to really deal with this global crisis we have. And CCL is a national organization, but it has hundreds of chapters across the nation and internationally. And in every state, there are multiple chapters. I think we've got several, 28, 30 in Washington alone. Having a chapter in Olympia makes perfect sense. Being the seat of state government, we have access to a lot of influential people. It also is a town that is steeped in activism. So we thought this is the perfect combination. It's an issue we both care a lot about. And Citizens Climate Lobby supported Initiative 732 formally, as well as 1631, the follow-up initiative that also didn't quite make it past the finish line. But the fact is, many, many organizations and people care about this issue passionately, and they realize that we've really got to turn into a new direction. So CCL has been an organization for, I think, about 7 or 8 years on this idea that we ought to place a price on carbon and that we ought to move to new clean renewables and new ways of thinking about reducing our carbon emissions. So their policy, which was in place for several years, was an attempt to promote formation of a piece of legislation at the national level that would have implications for all of our states. And recently, they were able to get a bill passed in Congress, in the House, and that bill has been circulating for a while now. It's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Fee and Dividend Act, and it is getting a lot of attention because I think more and more politicians and members of Congress are realizing this is an issue that American people really care about, and they want to see something done.
I want to welcome you to the 4th South Sound Climate Action Convention. My name is Tom Crawford. I'm the board chair of Thurston Climate Action Team, and I want to start out by saying how very pleased and honored I am that you've all chosen to spend your day with us and with Citizens Climate Lobby for this wonderful conference and convention we have today.
I also, too, would like to welcome you to our traditional ancestral territories. You're standing on the lands of what was originally the Stay-Chas people, and eventually what is now known today as the Squaxin Island tribe.
Citizens Climate Lobby and TCAT co-sponsored the gathering on Saturday, April 13th at Olympia High School. The over 300 attendees from around the Northwest had their choice of 32 sessions on topics ranging from electric cars to environmental grief, and from the changing climate's effect on healthcare to regenerative agriculture.
Worse, you start selling maybe a car, or maybe you sell jewelry or something, like rent a room or something, and then maybe you take on some debt, and you're starting to lose your resilience and your ability to stay at this place. And then if it keeps getting worse, you might sell your goats.
The effects of climate change on national security was presented by retired Navy Commander Bob Hallahan of the Whidbey Island CCL Group.
Where do you see yourself, in a few years post-degree? What sort of work do you want to be involved with?
I've given this a lot of thought. Right now, I'm focusing on possibly getting an internship at the UN, the United Nations. There's actually a general United Nations base in Vienna, very near my university, and so if I were to cinch that, I would have some experience and maybe even be able to work there eventually. I've always been interested in working for international organizations, especially the UN, because I think that is one of the, again, another prerequisite to solving this crisis. We need to have a coordinated approach with all countries in order to be able to address this. Another idea that I've had about what I'm going to do with my degree is maybe work for an environmental law firm as a policy consultant, possibly, let's see, so many different ideas. I mean, it's endless. I could be a policy consultant or a policy analyst, a policy writer, environmental policy mostly, I think. That's always been where my passion has lied.
Well,
so.
That's incredible, and the world needs leaders like you to be in those seats and to give your perspective and your experience and tell your story about climate. And that's so awesome and so empowering and amazing.
Thank you very much.
And I'm really excited for your journey with that.
Well, I just have to step in and say I went through my depression, and for everyone that knew me during that time, I was that negative person and I was doom and gloom and I really didn't see a path out. So if you knew me during that time, this is going to sound like a very different person today. But I joke that studying the environment is an exercise in depression, and there's a lot of truth behind that. But you know, you have to do. I'm the type of person where I feel like I have to do something. So here I am doing something, and the doing makes me feel better, even if the reality of the situation is quite dire.
Yes.
So I'm excited we have something to rally around, and the more you put this idea in front of people, the more familiar it becomes. So I'm happy to just be a part of normalizing this conversation, that we're going to keep having it. Washington State's having it. Some of our more progressive state friends are having it, and soon it's going to spread more than that. So I'm happy to be part of normalizing it.
Laying the groundwork does make a difference. It really does make a difference. And I feel it does in a few ways. One way is that it empowers the people, the volunteers. It gets their energy, their enthusiasm up. They talk about it. They share, snippets of news, personal stories with their friends, coworkers, and they connect the dots, and it creates energy for change. So that's one thing. Another thing, it starts making a dent in our carbon footprint, our global carbon footprint. And while that's not nearly adequate enough, when the time comes that civilization will turn course, we're at a higher footing than we were before. But another thing that struck me as really important is we're laying the footwork also for all kinds of changes in society, in our civilization, infrastructure. For example, we've seen these slides of the whole network for charging stations for electric vehicles along I-5, along I-90, along Highway 2, all the way up and down the state in the western states. That's creating, the opportunity to move right into a new paradigm. So there's that, but I want to mention one more thing about that. You see what a difficult conversation can lead to with a friend.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that is that I think having infrastructure on the ground enables politicians, even progressive-leaning legislators, to be bolder in their actions because they see what has already been accomplished, and a lot of people are enthusiastic about it. So I think that groundwork is really, really critical.
So shellfish are calcifiers. Whether it's a clam, mussel, oyster, lobster, or even coral, they take calcium carbonate from the seawater. They depend on that for building their shells. So with ocean acidification, as we know, the atmosphere is being inundated with more and more greenhouse gases. CO2 is the big one for us. About a quarter of that CO2 that goes up in the air, and it's human caused, as we know, about a quarter of that has been absorbed by the oceans over time. And we used to think that that was a good thing, because if the ocean wasn't acting as a shock absorber or a sink for all of that excess CO2, our atmosphere would be in even greater danger. We'd have even lower pH in the atmosphere and higher parts per million levels of greenhouse gases. But that's only true to a certain point, and what it's been discovered lately is that the ocean can only absorb so much. So over the last 250 years or so, the ocean has absorbed something like, oh, did I say 250 years?
Yes.
Yeah, 250 years. The ocean has absorbed over 500 billion tons of CO2. And the result is the oceans today are about 30% more acidic than they were at the beginning of the industrial age. So what happens when the ocean acidifies, it's never going to become totally acidic, but more acidic than it is now, is that carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the water, creates a weak carbonic acid, and what happens then is that in those waters, the carbonate ions that shellfish depend on for building their shell are actually bound up. They're soaked up by excess hydrogen ions in acidified waters. So the carbonate is just unavailable, or it's very scarce for an oyster, for example, to use. And this is especially troublesome for us growers when the shellfish are in their very early stage, like the larval stage or the juvenile stage. When a planktonic animal like oyster larvae is just drifting in the water and then it's ready to settle down and form its shell, that's when it's most vulnerable. And that's when they can't get the carbonate out of the seawater to build their shell. Or if they do, it costs them so much energy that that animal soon dies before it even develops very far.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great conference. It was really inspiring, and it was so good to actually lobby, to actually go in and go to the offices, see the offices, walk through the halls of Congress with all these other CCLers, and we're all working towards the same thing. That was really, really inspiring. Yeah, and one of the things that people should all know, and to state it right now, is that people should be able to go and contact their congressman. Everybody should be able to contact their congressman. And people think, oh, I don't want to write them a letter. I'm not going to. You don't have to. Call them. Call them. They'll have an answering machine, and you can just put it on the answering machine. I mean, really, it doesn't matter if it is a call, if it's on the answering machine, if you text them, if you write them a letter, if you write them an email, whatever it is that you want to do it. And if you can do it with a group, get everybody together and have a phone bank and call the congressman on something like that. So whatever it is that you care about, go ahead and call them and find out, because those people work for us and they want to know what we want them to do. Today is actually Congressional Education Day. It began on Monday, November 12th at the Omni Shoreham Hotel. Mark Reynolds welcomed us. We numbered about 600 strong. We had advocacy training and meetings with our small groups that would go out and meet our national representatives. All in all, the first day went about 12 hours.
I was really encouraged when we met in Maria Cantwell's office. We were not expecting to have the level of staff participation. We had a staffer from the Energy and Natural Resources Committee come there and speak very, very positively about our work, talk about bipartisanship, talk about the potential of having Republicans on board with this in addition to Democrats, which is key in the Senate.
Audience, because we all like to be with like-minded people.
Yeah.
with the issue of global warming, we need to talk to people who are not like-minded and get them to understand the gravity of this. CCL is a really sharp group of people with high skill sets about what's going on. They understand the challenges that we face, and the single impetus of CCL is, of course, to put a fee and dividend and start pulling. I use the metaphor a lot. If we don't all get our hands on that brake and pull it hard enough, there's hell to pay. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that with volatility of weather. We're seeing that with changing circumstances, rising sea levels, et cetera, ad nauseum. The fires that we're seeing. CCL's sole purpose is beautiful in that it puts the impact financially on that carbon, and yet it then comes back equally to American households. To help offset that fee. Yeah. And I think the people involved are dynamite. It's not a new fly-by-night organization or direction. It's been in existence over 10 years. And we had hoped to have a bill tabled in 2017 before the outcome of that election last. And so we're obviously having a lot of catch up to do since then.
What are we going to do with this next workforce of tomorrow in the electric industry if the electric industry is static and is going to less manpower? A hydroelectric dam can be running with one guy at home on his laptop. So the next generation of technicians is the Elon Musk that are building electric cars and the SpaceXs and
the dreamers, the people who've got ideas and they're being inspired.
We have to innovate
to conquer a problem that we're into right now.
So what if we could train these students to actually look at things differently and say, well, energy, whether it's a battery pack or a fuel cell, or if we still got round wheels going in circles. What if the next generation really wanted to get involved in this mobility thing, this digitech, there's tracking, there's all these things that happen. So part of this infrastructure is training the workforce of tomorrow to build it today.
So another initiative that I have been working on, and I got a little bit of money in the capital budget to do a study around it, is embodied carbon. So I talked earlier about steel, cement, glass is another one, sort of these energy intensive commodities that are kind of hard to deal with in a carbon pricing mechanism because they're priced on the market, the international market. And so, if we're raising the price of our steel, we're going to disincentivize the use of our steel here and incentivize the use of steel from other countries, which doesn't do the climate any good. We don't want to be importing this stuff when we can be using steel that's made with a cleaner energy grid and that sort of thing. So California passed a Buy Clean California bill that basically incentivizes less carbon intense building materials for their public buildings. And I introduced a bill to do that in 2018, and it ended up being a study bill that kind of looks at what kinds of policy mechanisms might be effective to encourage the use of materials basically that are made in Washington or made in our region in our public buildings that are less carbon intense than actually importing, rebar and steel and cement from other places. So much for us to protect, and there's so many forces that are making it hard for us to protect that, and we just have to keep going. And so I guess it's a plea to people to continue to communicate with decision makers, to do things like this, to show up at rallies, to write letters to the editor, to go doorbelling for 1631, to get on the phone and talk to their, other voters about 1631, to show up in the halls of the legislature asking for change. Legislators don't hear that enough from their constituents. And it's easy to talk to me because I'm friendly, but it's important to talk to all legislators about how important this issue is to you. And I do think it is the stories that will start to move people. And, sort of like, the fires and the orca, and those are the kinds of things that I think are going to move people to act. And it's super important to act right now.
So you've been interested in the environment for a long time?
A long time.
Yeah. And what inspired you to get into the preserving the environment?
Oh, that's a really, it's gonna sound crazy. And so at the sake of sounding like an insane person, I want to say ever since I was a little girl, I remember the moment I realized it. I just sort of looked around. I must have been 7, 8, and cognizantly saying something is wrong. Something was just telling me something was wrong, and nothing was wrong. Actually, I was in a fine environment, with my family.
Yeah.
And ever since then, as I kind of grew up, I've always had that feeling, and I've always just paid attention to nature. And then in high school, 2008, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, and I felt as though I saw it in my living room with my grandmother, and I felt as though I just had this overwhelming confirmation of everything I've ever known. I just remember making it a point to do something about it then and there. I was old enough where I understood what was happening, and I started in high school. I started this thing called the bottle locker because we didn't have a recycling program in my high school at the time.
Okay.
And all the girls would bring their water bottles, their sport bottles, to this one locker, and I'd have bags of bottles by the end of the day, and then I'd take them and I'd go cash them in. It was a good little way to get some income, and I was doing something good for the environment. I started a green club in my high school, and ever since then I've just been a spearhead for environmental stewardship.
Yeah, people didn't think you were a homeless person with all those bags.
No, I had my schoolgirl uniform on, and I'm just carrying these bottles down the street.
And I think the evidence is clear that if we want to have a successful long-term political approach to climate change, it really does need to be bipartisan. If it is a partisan issue, one side or the other manages to jam something through, it's only going to last until the administration changes. And so we really want it to be bipartisan. So that this Climate Solutions Caucus, it's grown, I would say, dramatically. I mean, there's room for pessimism about what's going on at the federal government, and I get that. But we've gone from 4 members in 2016. Right now we have 74 members, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, and they're very active. They meet regularly. They meet privately amongst themselves so they can have those important one-on-one political discussions. They have hearings. And they're committed to working together to come up with a bipartisan bill to introduce in Congress.
And in the Northwest, do we have representatives in the?
Yes, we do. Derek Kilmer from 6, I believe he's from, is a member there. There are other representatives from the state of Washington that I believe would love to be a part of the caucus. Denny Heck is one of those. If you're a Democrat, basically you have to find a Republican to join with you.
Oh, that keeps it bipartisan.
That keeps it bipartisan, and just the way the politics break down right now, there are more Democrats that would like to be a part of that caucus than there are Republicans. So it would be unfair to a representative from the state of Washington to offer a criticism that they weren't a part of the caucus because they are up against the issue of having to recruit a Republican to come in with them.
Just to mention, I think the big difference between the Citizens Climate Lobby's proposal and state level proposals really has to do with the distribution of the proceeds. So the Citizens Climate Lobby proposal would distribute the proceeds to individuals, basically as a monthly dividend. So that means there would be no industry exemptions, and there wouldn't be additional assistance to, for example, the poor, or you wouldn't have things like assistance for people losing their jobs, which our state initiative actually has provisions for that. First time I saw it, the first question I had about it had to do with whether or not, if you're just basically giving the same dividend to everyone, are poorer people more affected by a carbon tax than richer people? And because I really seemed to me that they would be. But I looked at the literature. They had, Citizens Climate Lobby actually had a report done on this issue. And more recently, MIT just released a series of reports, and they also have a report on this issue. And in both cases, they say that it's actually a progressive tax, so that the wealthier would actually pay more tax because they consume more.
How did you start that?
Well, that's a pretty interesting story. I was invited by a investment guy that I was working with at the time. We both shared a real passion about the environment and a real concern about climate change. This was back in 2007, 2008. So one day he calls me up and says, hey, there's going to be a meeting over at the Lacey City Hall, and some interesting folks are going to be there. Going to be talking about climate change and what we can do. Why don't you come on down? So I did, and it turned out I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing elected officials, and I'm seeing business people, and I'm seeing dyed-in-the-wool activists, and I'm seeing, government people, and I'm seeing, a variety of folks. And so I'm listening, and participating in the conversation, kind of listening to what's going on, and kind of a light bulb went on in my head and said, hey, this could be something that could really make a difference, because the right players seem to be in the room here that really, have influence on the levers of how things work in our communities, and this could be pretty cool and pretty exciting. So that became Thurston Climate Action Team. And founding members were, people who were at the time or since have joined city councils or county commissioners, some planners and education folks. Evergreen State College, get involved, and so it was a variety of really great folks. So then that turned into actually a partnership with Economic Development Council to do some energy efficiency work. And that really hit on the theme that one of the themes that we were trying to emphasize was there's really no conflict between doing good environmental work and having a good, vibrant, healthy economy in the local community. So there's really no in fact, the two support one another. So that was another sort of unique thing about this organization, that some of the partnerships we were able to form.
And we want to thank you for watching and
Thank
subscribing.
you. Yes.
Yeah. And you can still be there, so you can enjoy it anytime you want. Or not enjoy it, but learn something. Yeah.
And if you're interested in following me and my work, please like Olympia Community Solar on Facebook and Instagram. We are working to expand renewable energy access in the region. We're a group of young, driven people, and we can definitely use community support as we work together to transition to an equitable and accessible clean energy. And it's been a pleasure, and I hope and I wish you all well on your journey to sustainability.
Yeah. I need to thank CCL. Thank you, Citizens Climate Lobby, for all of the things that you do and the way that you are helping shape our government. I do want to thank Stuart and his lovely wife Andrea, who have been our hosts for this entire time. The beautiful view when you look out, when you see out the windows and you see the view, this is their place.
And the best snacks, really healthy, energizing.
Yeah.
And Louie.
And Louie.
Can we please
Louie
put
the
a
dog.
picture of Louie? Like,
So
we need a picture of him.
Yeah, we could do that. If you ever hear a dog in the background, oh, here he is.
Oh,
He's coming over your eye. Hi, Louie.
Oh, Louie.
You're a star, Louie. He is too. Says, where's the squirrel? Where's the squirrel? Well, it has been a pleasure to work with you. And,
You too. I hope it doesn't end. I
No,
hope it
yeah.
doesn't stop.
Let's see what happens, and then go to the website and look and see. I will post whatever's happening next on there. And you'll also, if you go on there, you might if you go on my website, you'll see that there's a film that I made when I was in graduate school. This is some time ago, but it's about Florida, about the sea level rise in Florida, and that was the documentary I made to get my master's in journalism, and that's on my website too. So, and all of the workshops that went with the South Sound Climate Convention, they're all there, and so drop by and take a look. And we want to thank you for watching and subscribing.
Yes.
Yeah. And you can you'll still be there, so you can enjoy it anytime you want. Or not enjoy it, but learn something. Yeah.
And if you're interested in following me and my work, please like Olympia Community Solar on Facebook and Instagram. We are working to expand renewable energy access in the region. We're a group of young, driven people, and we can definitely use community support as we work together to transition to an equitable and accessible clean energy. And it's been a pleasure, and I hope and I wish you all well on your journey to sustainability.
Yeah, you know, there's all kinds of, it's the transition that's coming that people have to, Stuart just pointed something out. I need to thank CCL. Thank you, Citizens Climate Lobby, for all of the things that you do and the way that you are helping shape our government. And hopefully, in the future, we will have a government that will understand where we're at and take the action that we need to have in order to fight climate change, hopefully. And with the CCL's help and all of those things, yeah. So everything is good. And I also want to thank Thurston Community Media too, for giving for the equipment and for showing our show and for all their support too. So
great.
There you are, Ari.
Thank you, Ed.
Last hug.
Last hug.
If you would like to know more about Citizens Climate Lobby, go to citizensclimatelobby.org or join us at the Olympia Center at the intersection of Columbia and State on the second Saturday of the month at 9:30 a.m. Thank you for joining us on Change the Climate.